From the banks of Dewey Lake, it's the Dewey Pod Monster.
All right, we're back. This is the Dewey Pod Monster podcast. This is your podcast about consumption. Lately, it's been mostly a podcast about horror movies, and that's not about to change, but it is still a consumption podcast. My name is John. I'm your host of this. We're going to call it a show. And with me this week, as always, is the host of the Dewey Pod Monster podcast. He's the authority on Michigan craft beer, or I think that's what it is. I don't know. It's been a minute. Sean, how are you doing today?
I'm great. The host. I don't know. Clever. Insert
You're the
clever
host
line.
with
We'll
the
edit
most.
something clever in right here.
You're just going to cut back in and say something clever.
Yeah. Something clever.
Yes, I like it. So, how are you doing today?
I'm okay. I'm on this. I did this. You don't want to care. You don't want to care. You don't care, but I'm on all this medication, so I'm like tired as shit all the time. But other than that, it's tits. It's all tits.
Yeah, you can be worse things than tired, I guess. So,
Except if you want to be awake.
Yeah, being awake kind of sucks. You got to deal with people. You got to host things like podcasts and shit like that.
Hosting duties, stuff like that.
It's a burden. So, catch anything good this week?
Oh, I did watch
chatting?
we're talking about this. So when everybody hears this, it's going to be a little bit out of sequence because we're just kind of recording a bunch of stuff for October. That's a little behind the scenes, a little BTS in the business. That's what we call that. So I watched
BS.
But Korean group. I watched not WrestleMania, the WWE like biography thing that we've been talking about. The new one was Degeneration X. So I watched Degeneration X. That was a good one. But my recording, quote unquote, ended with 10 minutes left. So, I mean, not that there's anything revolutionary or revolting in the 10 minutes. Yeah, I mean, I just don't know what happened to Road. I don't know what happened to Road Dogg. So if anybody knows how Road Dogg's doing, let me know. And Billy Gunn, I don't know what happened to him after wrestling. But yeah, that's what I've been up to.
He's probably just hanging out with his brother Tommy.
Oh yeah. You know what the thing about Rocky was at 4 with
the Russian with Drago?
No, with Tommy Gunn.
Was that 4?
That might be 5.
Was that 5?
That might be 5.
5 has that epic speech it's got that speech that Stallone gives where they're in like a warehouse or something and he keeps screaming at this chick and walking out of the scene and back into the screen to yell at her more. But he's very Stallone yelling, so it's not really like audible. It's just
it's intelligible.
Walks out, walks in, walks out again. This goes on for like 5 minutes.
The best part, the part that always bugged the shit out of me about that, Tommy Morrison plays Tommy Gunn. That's the fighter's name. Like they just give him, his name's Tommy Gunn, right? So Tommy Machine Gun. Like really? I mean, that's kind of a foregone conclusion. You're already naming the character Tommy Gunn. You're going to call him like Tommy the Potato Peeler Gun. I mean, that's ridiculous too. Might as well go that way. If my name was Tommy Gunn, I think I'd want my nickname to be like the Potato Peeler or the Hamburger Assassin or something just stupid like that.
Tommy Semi-Automatic BB Pistol.
Tommy Wacky Waving Inflatable Tube Man Gun.
That would work too.
I'd take that. That's what I want you to start addressing me as, the host and the Wacky Waving Inflatable Tube Man, Sean.
I'll try to remember that. I could probably fit that in, and then we'll air that episode before this one, and it'll really not make any fucking sense.
Yeah. What are these idiots talking about? What'd you catch? Anything good?
I caught up on a couple of those WWE biographies. I'm one behind you, so I watched the Bella Twins and Kurt Angle, and both of those have a sheer amount of just WWF depression going with them.
Yeah.
Like they both start with just horrible fucking beginnings and not as, I don't know, the Bella Twins one is kind of like a lot of, I don't know, they're fine. Like after you get past like, I was raped and I broke my knee in half and all this shit, it's like, God damn.
Yeah.
How are you going to follow that up by going in the, WWE or F or whatever it is? And they do, and they're fine. Like the second half of it's a lot more like we overcame adversity. So anyway, after they get past like one of them breaking their leg, like basically in half, and the other one going through some, we'll just call it sexual trauma because I don't really want to rehash that part. The second half of their story is a lot of like, oh, women empowerment in the WWF and truthfully, that's well past the point where I stopped watching, so I really had no idea any of this was going on. But it's not a bad episode. It taught me something I didn't know about the Bell twins, so I guess that's good. Then you pile up on that with Kurt Angle, which, man, that guy's got a lot of fucking neck.
Not as much as he used to have.
Like, he's still pretty big fucking, like, that guy's like 70%. You know what he looks like is the bad guys from the Super Mario Brothers movie, but like bigger neck.
Like the Koopas.
He's just got that, like, that's what they were, the Koopas. He's probably going to find me and beat the shit out of me for that.
He seems mellow these days.
If Kurt Angle does come beat the shit out of me for saying he looks like a Koopa, we'll try to have someone record it, because that's got to be worth at least 5 or 6 views.
That's good content right there.
I would hope. So anyway, his story is just like in so many ways, your typical wrestler story. It's like, I was really good, and then I got drugged and drugs, and then I got sober.
Drugged and drugs.
I'll be dead soon. So
I'll be dead soon.
It's the typical wrestler way, unfortunately. So then I also found some little documentary series on Hulu, which is called Culture Shock, which is basically this. It's from 2018, and it's just looking at these different things from mostly in the 90s. Like, I only watched 2 episodes. The first one I watched was, they're all about like an hour long or so, and it was on, the first one was on the show Freaks and Geeks, which I don't know if you watched that show, but that show for me was really relatable. Like, it helps it took place in Michigan, but a lot of the cliques and stuff that you would see, I was like, oh, this feels very familiar and fucking awkward and stuff. And I didn't really watch till well after it was on TV. I think I caught it on like a DVD set or something like that.
Yeah,
but
same.
It was a good show, and it was kind of cool to see him go back and talk about that and kind of show how that sausage was made, for lack of better wording. But it's very much so just drenched in, 90s nostalgia from like maybe 20 years later. So it's kind of entertaining on that. I forget what the other episode was that I watched, but it's all just that era. Like, we used to watch this shit type of documentary. So
that sounds right up my alley. I could lose a couple nights in that.
Yeah, it's only like 6 or 7 episodes, but again, about 45 minutes. It obviously ran in an hour time slot before, based off where it's cut and everything, but I was entertained by that. Then past that, the only other thing I really watched was Hard Knocks. I'm caught up on that for right now too. Don't really have much to say on that. It's just kind of watching them. I am finding myself making a lot of bets that the lines are going to go under the Vegas predicted win count, because I'm finding I have a lot. I think it was 6.5.
Okay.
So 6 or less. I don't know. My bets have all been at 7.5, because that's what it was when I was under the influence of substances and making bets.
I still owe Jeff.
But this
for
show,
last year.
You owe Jeff for last year?
Yeah, we bet that the over under was 5, and I bet over because I'm stupid. Clearly.
Well, like I said, I have 3 gullible family members. One that bet me, in his words, all you can drink at drafting table. I'm like, you should just bet me money, because it'd probably be cheaper for you.
Yeah.
And then 2 other bottles of bourbon are on the line. I'm like, I'm going to be pretty drunk after this season, apparently, because
you could be set for at least a couple days.
Yeah, sure. So if anyone wants to bet that the Lions are going to win more than 7 games, I'm your guy. I'll take that bet, because they're not going to do that. They're going to probably win like 4. So
the thing that I always love about Hard Knocks, watching it, is at the fantasy football draft, when all the people that have been watching Hard Knocks, you can tell, because they're the ones picking up whoever TJ Hushman's out, or whatever, 6 years after he isn't playing anymore, and they're picking up all these players.
Deep sleeper draft, man.
Yeah. Oh, you don't know, man.
Yeah. This guy really works his ass off. He's got a real motor on him.
I was trying to think, when I said, yeah, you don't know, man, I was trying to think of a Lions player besides like Swift or somebody, or Jared Goff, somebody that would actually be worth picking up in your league. I mean, Jared Goff is not that person, but I couldn't even think of any players, especially no offensive players. That's for sure.
And this is exactly why the Lions are going to win less than 7 games, because
they got DJ Chark. There we go.
Great.
They've Devin Funchess.
Do they?
I think so.
Oh, yeah, they were talking about him. They were talking about someone named Funchess. I didn't take the time to see if it was the same guy. Funchess was a receiver, but yeah, this is not a sports talk radio, so
this is not a sports
it's not
podcast.
radio either. as we talk about WWE and
Right.
I guess it's not sports, so we can count that. So what's your opinion on remakes in movies, Sean?
Generally, I don't like them. I don't think that they need to be done. If it's something like a remaster, where they're not a remaster, a reimagining where it actually is different from the original, I'm okay with it. But if it's something where they try to do shot by shot recreations of a movie,
Psycho.
I thought Psycho was pretty good. That's probably the only one that I thought was tolerable. But generally, I don't like remakes. I just prefer to let a movie stand on its own. I mean, we've talked about Halloween, right? That didn't need to be remade, I don't think. We thought the original
not
was
the way
so
it
good,
was remade.
So, yeah. And who remade it?
Right. So normally I would agree with you. And as we were running up to this topic, I kind of talked myself out of it for like a certain generation, because it seems like there were a hell of a lot of really good remakes that came out in our favorite generation, the 80s, because you got movies like The Fly, The Thing, and our topic for today, which is the movie The Blob. And the other thing that all these movies kind of have in common is
They start with
took a movie. Well, there's that too. They took a movie that was at least 30 years old. I think in the case of The Thing, that was like in the 40s or something like that, if I remember right. They took a movie that was good, but maybe just kind of ahead of its time. And then I'd say each one of those movies is not like, they're all different from the original, but not like so drastically different that you can't tell where the source material came from. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, 58.
58 for The Blob?
The original The Blob, yeah.
Yeah, so it was 30 years apart from this and the remake. But they all kind of ran with an idea and kind of took things that just, for whatever reason, whether it was a technology restraint or lack of vision, if you want to get all dark side with it or whatever, you just wouldn't be able to do in that previous era of film. And there's a stretch there where there's quite a few pretty good remakes in that run. You can make an argument that one of the better ones is, although it wasn't really received that way, would be The Blob. Now, I know you have a little bit, we'll say, a love affair with this movie. So why don't you give us a little breakdown on the synopsis or the plot of this movie?
Yeah, I didn't know that I had a love affair with this movie, but I do really enjoy it. So basically the premise is that let's talk about the characters first. We have...
You got Brian Flagg, who's our main, like, badass, and Meg Penny, who is the damsel in distress. And you have a lot of guys who pop up all over Hollywood, but those are your two main characters that you're following through this movie are Brian and Meg, sprinkled in with people who are really just, in a lot of ways, kind of a horror movie trope.
Yeah, fodder a little bit for The Blob.
Yeah.
Basically, so Kevin Dillon, who is Matt Dillon's brother, who I want to have a whole side conversation about that. He is Brian. He's kind of like the town dirtbag, like the troublemaker, the bad boy of the town or whatnot, of the small town in California. I believe it's in California. Looks like California.
Yeah.
Like Northern California.
It's shot in Louisiana, but it takes place in California.
Really? Okay. Well, I did not know that. And then we have Shawnee Smith, who plays Meg Penny. She is the not high school sweetheart, but she's like the cheerleader, right? She's like the head cheerleader, the homecoming queen, that kind of person. So we have these two characters. There's a football game going on. There's this football. He's the receiver. He asks Meg out for a date. They go out on a date. While they're out on this date, there's Pop Bottle Pete out in the woods collecting the pop bottles for the money, or the pop cans, I guess. And he sees something fly through the air. He goes to investigate. It's a meteorite that's hit the ground. Are you raising your hand? Yeah.
Brian's not the one that asked her on a date. Paul is.
Yeah.
The first.
Yeah, Paul, the football player guy. Brian is not a football player guy.
Brian is busy with Pop Can Pete.
Yeah. Busy being a dirtbag. Badass dirtbag with the sweet leather jacket.
Right.
So a meteorite crashes. Pop Bottle Pete goes to check out what the hell's going on. He finds there's a meteorite. As we learned with the stuff, when you find something in the ground, what do? Well, he didn't actually try to taste it, but he goes and tries to poke at it with a stick. It's something's up with it. It crawls on his stick and he's like fiddling with it, and it bites his hand. Basically, from that point on, we have the Blob. The Blob starts to overtake the town, and the military comes in to check out what's going on. Nobody knows what this thing is. The military, well, science science, and the military come in to quarantine the town, and the Blob grows from there, and then it's a fight to fight the Blob.
It's when shit gets real.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. 7 strangers picked to live in a house.
I will...
True story.
Yes. So before we get to the real world episode of the Blob, I will say that the idea of poking the Blob with a stick is far smarter than just immediately putting it in your mouth and swallowing it and saying, well, that tastes pretty good.
That's pretty good.
So for those who somehow missed it, we're calling back the movie The Stuff, which is got a lot of similarities to this movie as far as you're looking at essentially an amorphous tub of goo that is the bad guy in this movie. We did an episode on that a little ways back. You can always go back and check that out. That one's fun too. But if you like an old fashioned monster flick, this is going to be right up your alley, because this is 100% like, you could almost call it the American version of a Godzilla movie before the Americans started making Godzilla movies. There's so many things about this movie that it's really kind of a bummer that this movie it's really underrated for what it is. You watch this movie, and as far as the effects and the kill scenes and stuff like that, this movie holds its own with your Jasons, your Michael Myers, your any monster movie that I can think of. I wouldn't mind seeing the Blob kick the shit out of Pumpkinhead or something like that. That could be entertaining. Whatever monster comes around. But the kills in this movie, because of what this creature is, they're really kind of inventive and entertaining. And you see so many movies where the kill is just, I stabbed him and he fell down and went, ugh, or
a shadow on the wall.
Yeah. So because of what the Blob is, you really do see kills in this movie that I know I didn't see like any interpretation of similar to this before the movie, at least in how things are executed. And I really can't think of a good example of after this movie where you see, like, this movie is really unique in a lot of the ways they trim down the cast, we'll say. I can't think of ways that it's been replicated quite the same way, or even like homage the same way as what they do in this movie.
The cast goes from a whole town to a few people. The cast is a who's who of all these actors that you've seen in other things. We have the exploding guy from RoboCop. We have one of the dudes from The Walking Dead, the old guy from The Walking Dead is the sheriff. Just an assortment of random people. We have Del Close, the improvisational master, plays the priest in this movie. The thing that I wanted to say about this movie with the special effects, it's almost like a tale of two special effects movies. We have the practical effects are amazing. Like you're saying, the kills where there's one scene where Paul, the football player guy, he gets swallowed up by the Blob and he's reaching for Meg and he's just decaying, or the Blob is basically acidic and it's decomposing him. It's burning his flesh off, burning his bones in front of her eyes. She pulls on his arm comes off. Gross. There are scenes where there are people whose their faces are they're face down. You go to roll them over, they're like melted onto the floor. That stuff looks amazing. The Blob scene where Jeffrey DeMunn, who plays the old guy in Walking Dead, not the dude that lives in the house with the hot daughter, but the other old guy who gets hooked up with the young lady. I don't remember their goddamn names in that thing, but his face gets smeared against like a phone booth, like a glass phone booth, and his face just like pulls apart. They're really great. But when you get to the matte effects where they had to green screen or chroma key or whatever you want to call it, those are the stuff level not great. Like, they don't look so hot.
It's yes and no. There's parts with that where I will completely agree with you. And I also kind of like some of those scenes because they kind of really make me laugh in a way. Like,
yeah.
And I'll kind of touch on that when we get to the end of this movie, because there's a scene at the end that really makes me laugh my ass off every time I see it. But there's other scenes in this where, go ahead.
Is it the bookshelf?
No.
Oh, okay.
But that's funny too. I don't think that was a green screen shot. There's other scenes in this though where they're likely using green screen, because I don't know how they would get the shot that they get otherwise. But it still looks pretty good. Like, one of the things I did write a couple things down, mostly because I was drinking when I watched this movie and I didn't want to forget them, as you do. there's a couple shots in this where I'd really like to see I'd like to see a behind the scenes for the majority of the effects on this movie, just because, like you said, the practical effects in this movie, there's so many of them that are just so amazingly well done. Even the ones that are really simple effects, like the phone booth scene where they basically just, I'm assuming, fill up a phone booth with some kind of goo and it around it. It still looks really well done, and it'd be cool to see how they flood the phone booth from the outside rather than, I guess they could have just green screened that too, but I don't know.
The way that they cut that scene, the phone booth scene where it collapses in,
yeah,
they do an awesome job at editing that, because when I watched that last night, or 2 nights ago, whenever I watched this, it was like, oh shit, somebody must have really got hurt when they filmed this scene. And the other thing with well, I mean, that's kind of the point, right? So the other part that I was going to say, the practical, or not the practical, but the special effects, the matte stuff, the chroma key, the green screen, whatever. I feel like that may also be a victim of upscaling for a DVD. Kind of like when we talked with Sleepaway Camp, you could see the face of the person in the doorway. Yeah. I wonder if a lot of it looks worse than it did originally because it was upscaled, or the way that they converted it.
Yeah, there's no question that as great as HD can be, it can certainly kind of shed a light on some things that you don't want to see. Look no farther than your local news team to really have that pop out. But yeah, there's some scenes, like I said, back to my point, there are some scenes that are really kind of very dated looking, very hokey, and I don't think that's the HD upscaling or anything like that. They're just bad green screen, and that's where the tech was at that time. But there's others where I specifically am thinking of the scenes in the sewer when the blob is in the background, and I think they're trying to climb out of the sewer. Mm-hmm. I would assume that's a green screen shot, but it looks really good, especially when you compare it to some of the other green screen shots that are in this same movie. So I wouldn't mind seeing it. I'm sure it's out there. I didn't find it or didn't take the time to find it. I'd be interested to see how each shot like that would be done. If they wanted to give us some super special edition Blu-ray cut with all that extra shit, I would actually sit through and that'd be a special feature I would actually sit through and watch.
I wonder if a DVD commentary track would do some justice to that. I don't know if there is a commentary. I don't have the DVD, so I don't know if there's a track on it.
I don't either. I don't know. There's, like I said, I agree with you about the blue screen or green screen. I think there's a lot of points where it does. I'm assuming it overachieves. And again, I could be wrong. It could be a whole different effect or a whole different way that they're getting that look, but I don't know. So I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. And some of the other kills that really stick out, the diner scene where the guy gets pulled into the sink, that to me was always one that really stuck out. It's got kind of a real creep show feel to it, like the way that's shot and the way that the gore is kind of used in that. I don't know, for whatever reason, it always makes me feel like it's an extra scene from Creepshow, for better or worse. You mentioned the bookcase scene. That's more comical to me than anything.
That freaked me out for some reason. Like that, it's a lot goofier when you watch it than it is in my head. I think when I think of it, I think of it as being way more traumatizing, but it's a half a second thing that happens where a guy gets basically folded in half backwards and pulled through this tight space. And in my memory, it's a lot worse. But when I watched it, I was waiting, anticipating that scene coming up. And when I saw it, I was like, I can't believe that this was something that I was traumatized by, because it's laughable. Right now.
I actually find the scenes that creep me out the most now involve Del Close's scenes as the priest or the whatever he is.
Yeah.
Not just because of the weird twist that they tried, and I know this movie was supposed to get a sequel and then it bombed, so they scrapped it, which is why it has the weird ending that it has. But the priest, in this movie, he's one of those priests that he comes in early in the movie when Paul and this other guy whose name I can't remember, and I don't see him immediately here. They're basically in the drugstore buying condoms, and it's awkward and it's typical of teenagers buying condoms scene, I guess. But this priest comes in, it's one of those I couldn't tell you what a priest that does shitty things to kids look like, but when I see him, I can point them out.
I know it when I see it.
Scene. Right. I mean, he's a creepy looking priest in this movie.
Yes.
And he just gets creepier looking as the movie goes on.
Some of this movie, like you mentioned it with the sink kill, has a lot of kind of creep show vibes. It just comes across very creepy. There's some characters that are really creepy, or just things that happen that just have this kind of creepy vibe. But I just really enjoy the whole vibe of the movie. From the parts in the forest, in the woods, the beginning, to the town scenes, to the part where the sheriff is hitting on the waitress at the diner. It just has this feel to the movie that I don't know, there's something I can't really put my finger on, but it just has this real, I mean, it's 88 when they made this movie, so it has those 80s kind of vibes. It almost has some certain elements of like teen flicks, the TNA. I don't think there's any real nudity in this movie. I think there's like a bra.
I don't believe there is.
I think that's the worst you see. Yeah, but it has those kind of TNA vibes to it. Almost like a teen comedy kind of thing, but it's a teen horror movie and a straight legit horror movie too. It just, I think with all those things mashed together, and me being kind of very nostalgic about the 80s, even though I was barely in double digits at the end of the 80s, it just gives me those kind of warm fuzzies to watch a movie like this. I think the reason that I do like it so much is it captures the 80s, or the end of the 80s, so well.
I think the other thing it does really well is it walks a really good tightrope of being a movie that is a horror movie. It doesn't take itself too seriously, and it has some elements of comedy in it without turning into what so many horror movies in the late 80s turned into, which was a body count and a lot of really, really bad, horrible, like poorly executed comedy that just, it lands in retrospect because it kind of hits that so bad that it's kind of funny route, but it didn't land at, like, the first time you watch, you're like, these guys are fucking stupid. No one talks like this. This movie doesn't ever really feel like, it's not a horror movie, like, in the sense that it is a horror movie, but it's not in the sense like you're not going to feel like this terror or this like real tension or anything like that. At the end of the day, this giant pink blob is threatening the planet essentially, but you're never really seeing in the theater like, well, this will happen on Friday. There's no, it's a very unrealistic premise to begin with. It doesn't feel like there's any sense of realism to it. So it's not something that's going to pull you in to the point where, you know, like a movie like Halloween, where you can almost see it and be like, oh, this is relatively plausible to some extent.
Sure.
But it also doesn't take itself too lightly, where there's not like a guy just firing off one-liners that happens to be with the main character through the whole movie. There's not like a gratuitous sex scene just for the sake of throwing in a couple nipples and then tearing it. Well, I guess that kind of happens, but you don't see the nipple. So whatever. We'll half count that.
It's just that one scene though.
Right. He does have a pretty fantastic bar trunk, I guess.
Yeah, the dude opens
with a lot
the
of
back
open
of
bottles.
he opens the back of his trunk. I guess that's implied. I guess could be a
Right.
frunk, right? But it's full of all these liquor
be.
bottles. It's full of all these liquor bottles. Most of them are open, and all this other crap.
Right.
And he's mixing these drinks. That's the part that really reminded me of those kind of teen sex comedies.
I like that he's using a like a baking mixer to mix.
Yeah, it's
the
like
drink.
a hand mixer though. It has like a trigger on it
Right.
that makes it. Yeah, and he's mixing a drink with that, as if just pouring it
Right.
on top of it's not going to mix it for. He's basically drinking scissorp at that point.
He's exactly doing that, and he's got like a whole like array of banakas to choose from for this too. So he's kind of a creep, and he's kind of a dirtbag, but he doesn't last very long, so you kind of don't feel bad about it. But that's one of those points where I think they were going for some kind of comedic angle of that, but even that doesn't feel played up quite to the extent of what you see happen in a lot of other movies from this time period. Movies that I'm sure both of us love, but can readily admit that they get a little cheesy.
I like that this movie, there are no sacred cows. I mean, there are two. There are two characters that make it through, and there are a lot of characters actually that make it through, but there are people that are main characters, I guess, quote unquote, that you see throughout. They're featured pretty heavily at the beginning of the movie, and they don't make it. Like, they don't make it that far. They don't make it half an hour, some of them. Paul is one of those people that the way that he's presented I love when movies do this, and I actually really enjoy the ending because it is so kind of open, and you could tell that maybe they were thinking of making that sequel, but they couldn't. But the way that it plays out, it's like the perfect ending to this. But Paul is a character that at the beginning of the movie, the two main characters are kind of hanging with a little bit. It's situations, Pop Bottle Pete, they take him to the hospital, they all ride in the car together. You kind of feel like he's going to be around for a while, and then he's just, minutes later, he's just gone. Like, he's not coming back. There's no redemption. I mean, he's now the Blob. So I just enjoy that kind of element to this movie.
The way they set it up, they really give you the impression that Paul is going to be the hero of the movie, quote unquote, and Brian is going to be the dirtbag that either dies or becomes some kind of problem in the movie. And they do flip it really well.
Paul is the third billed cast member in this movie.
As far as Sacred Cows, though, like, I don't really think that of your main characters as any type of sacred cow. Like, if you kill everyone off that you're supposed to follow their story in the movie, all you have is a big giant pink blob just roaming the countryside, which I would probably watch that, but it's not going to be that great a movie. It's just kind of like, wow, they really made a movie about a giant pink blob that just roams the countryside.
Yeah, just destroys shit. I mean, maybe it's apropos, right? I mean, while we only have a couple, it doesn't roam the countryside, but it gets pretty close.
So as we're going through the movie, we're pretty much learning that this Bob is also indestructible, but the Blob, who's the bad guy of this movie, he's pretty much indestructible. He's going around, he's disintegrating shit, and this Blob goes from something that's probably about the size of like a soda can, something like that, right in that area.
Yeah, that's
to, by the time we get to roughly the third act of this movie, the Blob is essentially the size of the slime capsule at the end of Ghostbusters 2. So it's pretty large and in charge. Side note with that, there are clips of the Blob that were not used in this movie that they did recycle for Ghostbusters 2 for some of the slime scenes, which I thought was interesting.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
I did not know that.
Yeah, this movie was released by TriStar, which at the time was owned by, I just saw this before we recorded. I didn't really have this memorized, but they were owned by Columbia. So Columbia saw that they had another pink slime movie coming out a year later and just used some of the B-roll that didn't get used in this movie. So the Blob keeps getting bigger. And as the Blob keeps getting bigger, I'm going to keep calling him he because I don't know what else. I don't know why. The Blob keeps fucking shit up, going uptown, saying, I'm going to eat you, and pretty much succeeding and expanding. It's chasing our protagonist all over town. Eventually, it gets to the movie theater where there's a lot of people that it can kind of really put on some mass. And I don't know that I would call this almost like, this is probably because the movie theater scene in the original movie is probably the most iconic part of the entire movie. It's the scene where the Blob is essentially oozing out of every orifice of this movie theater and people trample each other literally on their way out to get away from it, which is also referenced in Ghostbusters 2 when they're all coming running out of the theater and there's the slime kind of falling all over. This is also not a Ghostbusters 2 podcast. This is a podcast about the Blob. Right. That was a pretty cool scene too, though, where you get to see the projectionist killed.
Yeah. Yeah, he's on the ceiling, right? Doesn't he get...
Yeah, and he's the most obvious rubber mask in this entire movie, but it's like, I don't care. It looks pretty cool.
Well, I think Elisa Eleniak, is that her name? The blonde in the car, where she scrunches up. That's kind of an obvious rubber mask, but this one is like...
Yeah, that's pretty... Yeah.
Yeah, this one's like, oh, this guy... It looks just like that. Like it looks just like the guy, but it looks like the Blob.
So this episode should come out either at the end of September or in mid-October or something like that. September, October. I would be willing to bet you on top of my Lions bets that you could go into any Spirit Halloween store and find a mask that is a reasonable facsimile of what you're seeing on this guy in this projectionist booth in the movie. But it works. It's fun. It's one of those scenes that it's like, this is kind of what I was saying. Like, this kind of horror movie doesn't scare me at all because it's so over the top in that sense that it's like, oh, that's fucked up. And that's something I haven't seen before. But at the same time, that's not I don't think I'm going to be like bukkake to the top of any movie theaters anytime soon from a gelatinous blob.
Depends on what kind of movies you go to.
Yeah, but I don't think the blob would be the one that's spackling me up there.
I mean, that at that point, you might want it to be.
Yeah, well, you make a good point. So this is also right around the time, though, when we start kind of working our way to the third act of this movie, which I think I said at one point already, but we're getting there. Is this right around the time where they figure out how to hurt the blob, or is that am I missing it? I feel like I'm missing a scene in between here.
Well, you find out how to hurt it near the beginning with the diner scene, where they put themselves in the freezer, and then you find out, it's sensitive to cold.
Shenanigans ensue, and the blob's in hot pursuit of our two leads of Brian and Meg, and basically we get to the showdown, and like you said, the military shows up, and this is where you get some real like B-roll monster movie type stuff, and the blob is kind of great. Like, it turns into these very phallic looking like arms that just kind of come and like straight up flip people over, throw them against the wall and stuff. I don't know why they think that shooting it is going to be effective, but let's try. Sure. We continue to unload on it as it gets larger. And somewhere in this madness of all this, they end up in it's like a city hall or a library, or it's a library because it's with bookshelf scene, isn't it?
Yeah.
Isn't it?
I would have said it was a church, but yeah, it makes sense that it's city hall or a library or something like that.
Somewhere that has books
and stuff,
possibly leather bound. Meg essentially grabs a fire extinguisher and starts putting out the blob, is kind of what happens. And it's kind of funny because the fire extinguisher effect it'd be like the equivalent of taking a Super Soaker 50. I'm specifying the 50 model because that's the one that you should know what it is. By you, I mean you, the listener, not you, the host.
The Sean.
The Seans. It'd be like taking that and just going up to like the forest fire in California and being like, gonna put you out now.
Yeah, I kind of liken it to the same effect, well, with a lot less effect as the torch to the zombie. It's kind of like, it recoils, and it's like, it's going to like maybe affect 3 of them. But there's a horde of them around you that you have to worry about.
Right. But what's kind of fun about this is you see Brian steal what is essentially a fire extinguisher-mobile. It's like a pickup truck with a giant fire extinguisher inside of it.
It's a snowmaker.
Now, again, is that what it is? Yeah. I thought it was like a fire truck of some kind.
No, they set it up early in the movie because when his bike breaks down, he goes to borrow the ratchet set. The mechanic guy says, we got to fix these up for the weekend. It's going to be a lot of snow, blah, 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 blah. And he's like, it didn't snow a drop last year because snow comes in drops. And so they set that up to have the snow machine. The mechanic, fixes the snowmaker, and that's what he drives over. It's like like you said, like a tanker.
I missed that because I was going to talk shit about it being a fire extinguisher truck.
It goes around the town, fills up all the fire extinguishers. All the business owners come out. Time to fill up the fire extinguisher. It's that time of year again.
Daylight savings. Change the battery in your smoke detector, and you go see the fire extinguisher truck.
That's right. Get a fill up.
What I like about this truck, though, is it's got my favorite effect of the entire movie is with the truck. Not because of all the firefighting that it's doing or blob fighting, but because the blob literally it looks like a cat that just like flips over a cat toy. The way the blob moves and just kind of like bats it away, and it just totally does like a 360 flip and right out of screen. But Brian's fine. He gets out of it. He's like, that sucked. And moves on and goes back. He does
get trapped, and she comes out to distract the blob. Meg comes out to distract the blob because he's trapped in the cab, and it's like enveloping the truck. But she comes, you bastard, because it gets really insulted. The blob gets really insulted when you call it a bastard. So it starts chasing her, and the tank has separated from the truck.
Yes. I kind of want to see, maybe I need to watch it. I need to watch this movie more often to begin with. This is a really fun movie to watch.
It is, yeah. It has a lot of those horror elements, has a little bit of suspense, but it is also kind of silly. Has a lot of silly kind of moments, but it doesn't take itself too seriously, but like you said, it doesn't take itself lightly either. It has a very a lot of gravitas, there's a lot of a lot riding on what's going on here in this town for this man-made blob, which we shouldn't really get into. I think you should really watch, audience, you should really watch the movie to understand where the blob comes from. But yeah, I think it just doesn't take itself too seriously, but it's not, there's some weight to it.
But and that's what makes this movie work. It's a well-balanced movie as far as how it's telling a story. You never really get to the point in this movie where you feel like the blob's going to win and we're going to end with just like a purple globe or pink globe or whatever. I would have enjoyed that ending. Maybe that's what they were going for in part 2. But there's a couple little subplots in this movie. Like you said, where the blob came from is one of those subplots that it almost feels like it's part of how the story moves along at certain points. But I guess that's how you tell a story, is you insert parts of the story that move the story along. So it should do that. The storyline involving the priest and what he's doing and how his weird twist at the end is all kind of, it's one of those stories that you're like, where the hell is this going? And it feels like it didn't get fleshed out because it didn't get the sequel that it was supposed to get. So I could see, presumably, like if they made a second one that was a good movie also, it'd be one of those things you could look back on like, oh, that's really cool how they planted the seeds in part 1 for this weird thing to happen in part 2. But I appreciate the fact that they had the balls to try to put it in there in the first place, because if you don't, then you just have to try to pull the story out of your ass if you think you're going to make a second one.
Yeah, and a lot of movies don't go that extra mile.
Right.
It's just kind of like, oh, this is what it is. You just have to believe this is how it is. But this, they give you the breadcrumbs, as Brian mentions early in the movie. They give you the breadcrumbs to kind of find your way to it.
Yeah. Trying to remember how they actually killed this thing. I know it was with cold. Like, was it just the fire extinguishers, or what was?
Yeah, they blew up the tanker part,
snow truck thing.
Yeah, and that somehow creates enough snow. I mean, it's they talk the thing
It's questionable.
They talk about how hot it is. It's supposed to take place in October because the kid takes his jacket, and the mom tells, "Hey, take a jacket. It's October." So they talk about how hot it is in the city. It's a little maybe unseasonably warm or whatnot. And then the tanker thing blows up and snow comes down, and from it exploding and snow coming down, that somehow freezes the blob into these little crystals. And they say, what do they say? They're going to take it to the city dump or something. Maybe they somehow encase it.
They make mention of taking care of it, whatever that means.
Yeah.
So,
however they take care of it.
We forgot to mention a couple things in this movie, too, as we were kind of all over the place on this one. I do like the movie that the two kids are watching within the movie, because it very much so reminds me of Clark Griswold and Christmas Story or Christmas Vacation. I know this movie has, as far as the people that like directed and produced this movie, this has guys that have worked all over, like all of the big slasher franchises. So that's obviously what they were going for in that scene. But every time I see him come out with that hedge clipper and that flannel shirt, I'm like, well, Clark is just way early on Christmas this year.
Right.
So,
yeah, he's got the movie in the movie is the Hedge Clipper Massacre. Is that what it's called?
I don't remember.
And the guy
calls it some he calls it some slashy flick or something like that.
And the guy has a hockey mask, like a goalie mask, and a not even a wireless hedge trimmer. It's like the one with the full on cord.
It's a very 1986 hedge clipper.
Yeah.
I also think it's interesting that this movie has the fortitude to kill off a kid, which you don't see that a lot in horror movies in general. Like I can only think of a couple others that do it, but they actually kill off one of the kids in the process of the blob becoming uber mega blob.
Oh yeah. I mean, the movie theater though, they're probably the only kids in the movie theater, but yeah, there's nobody that's really safe. And that's what I like about it too. They go, there are people in the hospital. There are just regular everyday folks, which include kids. And it's kind of not refreshing. I mean, you don't want to see anybody die, but it's different.
I'll go as far to say it's refreshing. Kids are fucking annoying. You've said this many times on this show.
I would never say that.
You know, sometimes
if my kids ever listen to this, I love you.
I think the phrase was, kids are stupid, I have two of them.
I don't remember ever saying that. I don't think it was recorded, so you'll never prove it.
No, never. We don't record anything on this podcast. I don't know what you're talking about. So, but no, this like you said, there is no sacred cow. There is no, like, it doesn't hide from anything with it. It's just a very straightforward kind of, it's more of a monster movie than a horror movie, really, which I guess that could fall under the same umbrella, but I don't know. You don't get a whole lot of that anymore. And even at this point in the 80s, you had a lot of creature movies, but you don't get like a straight monster coming to destroy the town type movie very often.
I gotta mention our main bad boy character, Brian Flagg, played by Kevin Dillon. He has not only, I don't know, it's like at the same time, it's the most ridiculous, but the most like heroic mullet I have ever seen. This, I don't know if it's a wig. I don't know if it's his real hair.
It's extensions.
Is it?
Yeah, so that was one of the things I did see is he was basically bitching about his hair in the movie. And he had short hair before the movie, but I think it was, what's his name? The guy who did The Walking Dead, not the actor.
Darabont.
Darabont. He told him that he needed to have longer hair in the back to look more street and more tough, like the kids of the 80s do. So they gave him hair extensions to make him have the look of rough kids in the 80s. Yeah.
It is like,
so it's not his hair.
His hair is, I can't even talk. How just,
he looks like an extra in a Motley Crue video.
It is so like ratty and stringy but thick at the same time. It's got this wave to it. It is just ridiculous. And his outfit, if you could just picture this in your mind. I'm going to the theater of the mind here. A brown mullet on a white guy with a dirt stash, and Kevin Dillon's teeth are really bad in this movie. He must have gotten them fixed since, obviously. He has this like stiff leather jacket on, white t-shirt, and stonewashed jeans and cowboy boots.
White button-up shirt.
Yeah. Not like a t-shirt. You're right. It's like a Oxford or something, like a button-down.
Yeah.
It's like he just looks ridiculous. He has the strut, like he has like this 80s tough guy kind of strut, which I guess makes sense.
He looks like a roadie / door guy for the band Warrant.
That's a perfect descriptor.
He's not good enough to be in the band, but he's good enough to open the door and tell people you need to have a laminate.
Yeah. Where's your pass? And I don't understand, just on a tangent here, I don't understand how sometimes there's siblings of famous people that get famous too. Like Matt Dillon is a legit good actor, and not to say Kevin Dillon isn't a good actor, but is it just you see hey, do you have a brother? You're a really good looking young guy. Do you have a brother or a sister, maybe a family member? And they say, yeah. And they said, bring him in. We'll give him his own movie. I mean, he was in a few movies. Kevin Dillon was in a few movies. He was in Platoon, for crying out loud. He was in a few movies, not great movies. Platoon's probably the height of his early career and maybe his whole career. But I just don't know how that works. Like, how did they both get discovered? That's a question I've always had. Just going to throw it out there to the universe.
I don't know about the Dillons, but I mean, you have the Calkins that were just like forced into it as child labor.
True. But I'm talking
and
like
those three have been
like the Cusacks.
Those three have had varying degrees of success. Yeah, they're the Gyllenhaals.
Yeah, you know the Culkin. One of the Culkin brothers is on Banner of Heaven, Under the Banner of Heaven on Hulu.
Did not know that.
Yep.
So
learn something new every day.
I actually don't mind now that they're adults and not like annoying bratty kids. I've actually found that more often than not, the stuff that the Culkins pop up in is actually, they're not bad in it. Like the ones in Scott Pilgrim, and he's pretty good in that. I think that's Kirsten or something like that.
Kieran.
Yeah. Whatever.
I mean, Kieran Culkin, he's got Succession too, which is one of HBO's biggest shows right now. So he's hitting it out of the park recently.
Anyway, so we're talking about the Blob on this episode. Eventually. So, I mean, do you have a lot to add to this at this point? I mean, this is kind of a straightforward movie, but it's one of those movies that really, I like that we're talking about this one because this little dinky podcast should kind of shed light on a movie that really does deserve to have some people go back and watch it. It is one of those movies that was, it's funny. It's like, even looking at this, it's not reviewed like super well. It wasn't critically acclaimed. Even looking at it on Rotten Tomatoes, like the audience score is 56, which I think is painfully low.
Yeah.
At least in my opinion. It's by no means like a perfect movie, but It's definitely a fun movie to watch. Do you have anything to add on to it before we throw on like any hot dogs on it?
No, I think I'm ready to just jump right into the mustard on this one.
Why don't you lead us off?
So I think that, like you said, I think it's criminally kind of underrated. This is, even on IMDb, it gets 6.6 out of 10. So I just think that's kind of low for this movie. I think there are probably a few holes you could poke into it. It's not a perfect movie by any means, but it's super entertaining. Like you said, it's kind of a mix of like a monster movie, a disaster movie, and a horror movie. All those kind of three things rolled into one. You don't get that very often. And like I said earlier, the thing that I really enjoy about this, me personally having a lot of the 80s kind of nostalgia, early 90s, mid 90s nostalgia vibes, I really enjoy it because it's a really good mishmash, not a mishmash, but like a amalgamation of an 80s teen movie, a horror, kind of slasher-y kind of movie. It's not a slasher movie, but it has those kind of vibes to it. It has those kind of comedic elements. It doesn't take itself too seriously, but there is weight behind a lot of this stuff, and nobody is really safe. The main two characters are pretty safe, but there's just things that happen that, like I said, the third highest billed person in this movie dies within the first 25 minutes. So it kind of gives you at the beginning this impression that you're maybe not, they're not tipping their hand at what you're really in for. Like if you didn't know what you were getting into when you started this movie, it really blows anything you were thinking that was going to happen out of the water. I would say for me, this is probably one of my more favorite, like unknown, not unknown, but underrated kind of movies. I would give this probably a 7.5 to an 8 out of 11. I can't even think of fire extinguisher trucks, and it's just a movie that I feel like I can go back and watch. There wasn't a time that I'm like looking at my watch. We talk about that. That's a really good metric that we use a lot of times. Like how many times did I have to look at my watch? I'm trying to look up the runtime of this. It's
like an hour and a half.
Yeah,
around there.
It's a nice kind of solid hour and a half. This budgeted was 19 million estimated budget. Its gross in the US and Canada, or actually worldwide, was only 8.2 million. So it did not make even half of its budget back, and I think that's really a shame. But I feel like this is a movie that, looking back on the mid to late 80s, should be like an 80s horror classic kind of movie.
Yeah, so this movie for me, I mean, the things this movie gets right, it gets so right. There's no one in this movie that you really follow that is a hateable character. Like every character is at worst watchable, and at best someone that you can either relate to, or you don't necessarily want to see them die a blobby death, but you also don't necessarily feel bad when they die a blobby death because it's entertaining and well executed. It's a movie from 1988, so the effects often do look like a movie from 1988, both in a good way and both in a bad way at times. I don't have a problem with that, because when it gets almost too hokey, it almost brings a little bit of unintentional humor to it, and I personally really enjoy that in movies. So you're never going to hear me bitching about that unless it's a Predator movie. Yeah, I mean, everything about this, like, again, to me, this is a criminally underrated movie. It's, if we're putting it on the hot dog scale, I'd also probably go 7.5 hot dogs out of 10 Calkin brothers. Mostly because I can't say, I do sometimes rate things on IMDb, or at least I used to do it a lot more, and apparently I had this one rated. I rated it a 7, and they don't let you put half ratings in there. You have to put either a 7 or an 8. There's absolutely no reason to avoid this movie. It's just one of those movies that, as much as I enjoy it, I tend to forget about it, which maybe that's because there's not the hype or train around it, or not people talking about it on a regular basis. So when we came to do this episode, it's probably been I watched it once recently on cable, but before, not really paying attention to it. It's probably been like a good 4 or 5 years since I'd really sat down and actually watched this movie from start to finish. And the whole time I'm watching, I'm like, why the hell don't I watch this more? Because it is really fun with it. But I guess that's its biggest downfall, is it kind of blends into a lot of other things and can become almost forgettable in that sense. But at the same time, when it comes to like remakes of any genre, but horror especially, This is one of the best. There's so many things that it does right. The things that it changes from the story, it just kind of enhances it. It doesn't take anything away from the original. It honors the original in a lot of ways that are really well done. The only reason I say that it's not the best remake is because there's one that I think is kind of definitively the best that we haven't done an episode about yet. That's a very winter movie, but we'll get to that when we get to that. But there's absolutely no reason to avoid this. This movie's, like I said, it's fun as hell. Don't overthink it. Just kind of sit back and pop some popcorn and enjoy the hell out of this blobby craziness.
Yeah, I would say anybody that's into body horror or that's just into maybe a student of practical effects or likes to see old school effects that are not CG, this is a movie that you should watch. It has a lot of things in it where the practical effects are filmed in a way that you watch it and you're like, how did they do that? There's a lot of things that happen that you're like, man, that's a really cool effect. I wish I knew how they did it.
Yeah, and that's why I said I would really like, whether it's a commentary track or a behind the scenes like featurette or whatever, both the good and the bad effects, like it'd be great to see how the sausage is made on each of those, because it's, the practical effects are so well done that, I mean, like I said, I think I said this at the beginning of this episode, I think they hold their own with any of the great horror movies that came out in this decade. I guess they're just not as, the movie as a whole isn't as captivating, which is, I guess, where it would be a downfall, but we don't think that way. We think you should watch it, God damn it. All right. Well, this movie, again, we're both advocates of it. I know this is on Tubi right now. I'm not sure how long we'll be on there, but this one pops up on streaming pretty regular. It's, like we said, it wasn't a big box office hit, so I'm sure you could find it relatively easy. So check it out. Make it part of your Halloween rotation or just your, Sunday rotation. There's a religious aspect to it, so that works. In the meantime, make sure to follow us. We're at Dewey Pod Monster all over the place on all the socials. Make sure, if you can, we would greatly appreciate if you subscribed and liked and shared these episodes, left us messages, all that good stuff. You can do that at anchor.fm/DeweyPodmonster, or you can find us on Spotify, Apple, Android, wherever you get podcasts. Sean, go plug your stuff.
You can find me at youtube.drafttherapy.com. That will take you to my YouTube channel, which I talk about Michigan beer. It's been a little bit since I've talked about it, but maybe someday I'll talk about it again. If you go to youtube.drafttherapy.com, you can see when I do that. You can also find me on the social media networks at Draft Therapy.
All right. Well, in the meantime, kind of WAP stuff, all that good stuff. We'll talk to you next week. Cheers.
Blob it up.
What was I going to say? What we were saying before that? How do we get to this point?
Where are we? Who are you?
Can I give you an anecdote about the TriStar logo at the beginning of the movie?
Absolutely.
So for those that don't know, the TriStar promo or logo that starts all their movies off as a Pegasus that runs on the clouds, and it comes up to the camera and it rears its front legs, and the TriStar logo, the triangle, says TriStar, and there's the drawing of the Pegasus. My kids were terrified for some reason. I have no idea. Up until probably, a couple days ago, we're terrified of the TriStar logo. So, like, I think Muppets Take Manhattan is a movie that starts with the TriStar logo, and they would cover their eyes or plug their ears and close their eyes so they wouldn't have to hear the music, wouldn't have to see it, because it just scared them for whatever reason. I have no idea. It's kind of weird. I mean, it's a little odd.
I'm equally as amused that you said until a couple days ago.
Yeah.
Because that makes me think they saw and they just go, yeah, this isn't really anything. So,
well, maybe, they just snapped out of it.
Right.
They could run away in terror again. I don't really know. I don't think we've seen Muppets Take Manhattan in a while.
Last Muppet movie I watched was Muppets in Space, and that holds up better than I thought it would. It's Muppets and they're in space.
Go figure.
I'm a big fan of taking intellectual property and just shooting it into space. It usually ends well.
Look at Jason. Worked well for Jason, right?
Jason, the Leprechaun, Tom Hanks. Yeah, nothing bad happens when you go to space. So anyway, this is a podcast about the Blob, so let's go back to that. Sorry, Tom Hanks. I don't know if we'll ever talk about a full Tom Hanks movie,
about
but
you another
maybe
day, Tom.
Maybe you talk about Splash or something.
Mazes and what's that? Mazes in the Dungeons and Dragons movie that he did.
He did a Dungeons and Dragon movie?
It was like his first movie. God, what is it called? Mazes. And again, this is a Blob podcast, but he has this delusion. He's like a college student. He has like a mental break or something. And he thinks he's in his Dungeons and Dragons game, but it's like real life. I can't believe I don't remember what the name of that movie is.
I don't have any memory of this. Fucking Tom Hanks distracting us.
I know.